The brain is actually this dynamic fluid system. If you were to take just a cubic millimeter of brain tissue, you have as many connections there as you have stars in the Milky Way galaxy. This course is full of surprises. You actually have Pokemon represented in your brain. How do mountain goats get so good at leaping up rocks? How do blind people dream? Every few minutes, you will come across something that will blow your hair back. Imagine having 360-degree vision. Sounds like science fiction right now, but it's not going to be in 20 years. Your brain and my brain and your brain and your brain and your brain are completely different. This course is about brain plasticity, which just means how does the brain change? Every second of your life, the brain is chronically adjusting itself as we absorb the world around us, and then we remix what's in our heads. We bend and break and blend it, and the question is, why? In this course, you're going to learn how this 3-pound inner cosmos that you carry around on your shoulders absorbs the world around you and makes you who you are.
Okay, how many of you have ever seen a baby zebra get born? Or a baby horse? How many of you have seen something like that? Okay, a few of you. All right, so what you might have noticed is that in about 45 minutes, it wobbles to its little legs and it starts running around, right? But how many of you have ever seen a little baby Homo sapien get born? Okay, you might notice that they're not moving around in 45 minutes. It takes them a really long time to start walking around. So why is that? Well, this is what we're going to talk about, because it turns out what Mother Nature developed with humans was a trick, which is dropping the brain into the world half-baked and letting the world wire it up. And that's the notion that we're going to be talking about. What we're going to cover is we're going to get a deep understanding of what brain plasticity is and what the consequences are. Okay, so my goal for this first lecture is to give you a sense of how to think about the brain. And then in successive lectures, we're going to dive into more detail. And so when you look at the animal kingdom, what you find is plasticity everywhere. So if you have a dog, you know that you can teach the dog some tricks and it can learn a few things. But it's really limited. It's not able to do all of the things that we are able to do. And the reason for that is because of what this course is about. It's this thing that's very special about humans. So when you think about the human brain, you can't think about it as hardware and you can't think about it as software. It's what I'm going to call liveware. And the technical term for this that we use in the field is brain plasticity or neuroplasticity. But I'll tell you, the reason that I don't use that term all the time, plasticity, is because it was coined by William James because he was impressed with plastic manufacturing. That's where the word comes from. So you take plastic and you can melt this material down and make something like a toy out of it, and it'll hold that shape. It'll hold onto that shape, and that's what we love about plastic. And so William James thought, look, with the brain, you're doing something, it has experiences, it changes the shape of the brain, and then it holds on to that shape. So he used the term plasticity. But the fact is, we might be beyond being impressed with plastic toys at this point, because what you've got is a massive forest of neurons underneath the hood there. We'll be talking about some details about that. But every second of your life, this is changing. This is moving and growing. Every second of your life, your brain is changing. You've got neurons. Those are the specialized cell type of the brain. They're seeking, they're plugging, they're changing their strength of connections, they're unplugging. And this is what's going on every moment for you. And so that's why I think we need a new term beyond plasticity. Whether intentionally or not, the term plasticity, we usually think about it as, okay, something obtains a shape and it stays there. But if you think about something like a city, we happen to be in Miami right now, so take the city of Miami, you know, it's constantly evolving. It's constantly in flux. Cities always are. Where they build their buildings and their new roads and how they're changing their immigration policies and how they're deciding taxation and whatever. Cities are constantly evolving, and that's what's going on with your brain too. That's why we're going to use the term liveware. Now, one way that we can really see what is special about live wiring is to just look out an airplane window. So you're flying, you look out the window, you see a forest below you. What you can notice is that the creatures in the forest are doing the same thing that they have been doing for the last 100,000 years. I mean, they're just living their same lives and eating and mating and sleeping and whatever. But you arrive at your destination city, and it looks like a motherboard has risen from the earth because of one species. There's one species that's doing something different from all the others. And we have taken over every corner of the earth, and we have gotten off the earth, and we've invented skyscrapers and symphonies, and we've looked with ever-increasing detail into the functioning of our own brain. So there's something really different about us, and the question is, what is it? We've, outcompeted every species on the planet. If you take something like a Komodo dragon and move it from Indonesia to snowy Canada or something, it's not going to survive there. And so the question is, what is it about us that allows us to move all around? What makes humans stand out? So there are a few things that make us stand out. It has a little bit to do with, thumbs and larynx and so on, but the bigger thing has to do with the structure of the human brain. So when we zoom in on the brains of our neighbors in the animal kingdom, one of the things we see is it's not just the size that matters. One of the issues is that we've had this massive expansion of the cortex, which is the wrinkly outer bit on the outside. And one of the consequences of this is that we have much more distance in between the input and the output. And that allows, many more possibilities, computationally speaking. When we have some input, we don't have to just be reflexive. We can think through lots of different possibilities. So if you throw some food in front of a rat, it's going to eat the food. But you throw food in front of a human, the human says, well, I'm on a diet, so on. And so we have lots of possibilities because we have so much cortex. That allows us to generate a lot of rich possibilities. We also have a much larger prefrontal cortex. That's the bit behind the forehead there. And this is the part of the brain that allows you to generate what ifs and to think about potential futures before you take an action. So, part of the human standout is what it is because of these changes in brain anatomy, this, just this explosion of the cortex. The other thing to note is that our brains are really big compared to our body size. We have unbelievably large brains. So, the human brain is about 3 pounds, and it has 86 billion neurons. And the thing to note here is that every neuron in your head is as complicated as the city of Miami. Every neuron has the entire human genome in it. It's trafficking millions of proteins in very complicated cascades. And each one of these is connected to about 10,000 of its neighbors, which means what you're looking at is something like 200 trillion connections in the brain. So this is the kind of thing that bankrupts our language. We have no way to even talk about a system this size, except we know that this is you. All your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, the agony, the ecstasy, it's all happening right there. And how do we know that? It's because if you damage even a very small part of your brain, that can change you entirely. If you damage another part of your body, like you hurt your pinky or something, you're sad about that, but you're no different as a person. But you damage an equivalently sized little chunk of brain, it can change your decision-making, your risk aversion, your capacity to name colors or name animals or understand music. Any of this stuff can change just based on very small damage to the brain. And that's how we know. Given this number of connections in the brain, if you were to take just a cubic millimeter of brain tissue, you have as many connections there as you have stars in the Milky Way galaxy, just in a cubic millimeter. So it's an enormously complex system. But what we are going to talk about in this course is that it's not just the number of parts that make the brain interesting. It's the way that those parts interact. So when you look at a textbook on the brain, if you just pick up a textbook on the brain, you'll see that everything is, neatly mapped out. You've got this region devoted to this task, and this area exists for vision, and this for hearing, and that for decision-making, and so on. But what we're going to see is that this approach is actually very limited. And this is why I'll sometimes make an analogy of the brain as a globe. So, when you're a young student and you learn about history, you think, okay, all the borders of the countries are there, And that's the way it has to be. But as you get older, if you become a historian, you realize, wow, there's a lot of happenstance involved in that. And if you reran history just a slightly different way, all these country borders would look very different. If this would-be king had died in infancy, or this corn pestilence hadn't happened, or this warship had sunk at the beginning of the battle, or whatever, then everything would be different and the borders would be different. That's the right way to think about the brain, too. It's a very fluid system. And sometimes we get used to the way that we see it. We think, oh, that must be the way it has to be. But it doesn't. And we're going to see many examples of that in this course. To understand why there's this dynamism in the system, we have to dive down to the level of the neurons. So we're going to spend some time here. Now, as a side note, when we look at videos like this, they're not terribly accurate. Can somebody tell me why? Someone have a guess why this is not so accurate?
The distance?
The distance, right. It's because what these videos show is lots of space in between the neurons. And the reason they have to do that is because otherwise you wouldn't see anything. It would just be everything all smushed together. When we look at pictures of neurons that have been stained so that you can see the neurons, we usually see things like this, which makes it look like there's distance between these. But the reason that we see this is because when people come up with staining techniques for neurons, the chemicals that are really useful are those that impregnate just a few of the neurons and not the rest. So in other words, the staining chemical has a very low probability of getting into a neuron. Why is that useful? Because then you can see a few of them. If you had a chemical that got into all the neurons, you wouldn't see anything at all, because everything is packed so closely together. You can only resolve the distance in between neurons with electron microscopy. That's how packed everything is in the brain. So back to this, it's actually like 100 times denser than what you see in a video like this. But I think this is important for us to look at videos like this, because this is the right way to think about the brain, is think about it like a forest. You've got this unbelievably dense forest that goes on and on. I did a calculation watching this video of how long it would take you to get from across the human brain at this pace. So give me a guess how long it would take you to get across the human brain if you were moving at this pace through it. 1 second. An hour. A week. 9.5 years is how long it would take you to get through the human brain. It's really stunning, right? That's how large a system we're talking about. And the thing to understand is that each one of these neurons has its own life. Each one of these neurons is like a person that's striving to survive and do the right things and, make the right connections and, have the right dating life and so on. That's what's going on here. And it would take, that's the size of the system that we're talking about here. So here's a dish that I'm just going to show you here. This is just 7 or 8 neurons plated out on a dish. And you can see the way that they scramble and they live and they compete and they move around. Instead of just seeing this with 7 or 8 neurons, try to picture this with 80 neurons or 800 or 8 billion or 80 billion neurons to give you a sense of what is happening under the hood. Okay, now the other thing that I'm going to emphasize every lecture is that everything that you know and believe and think, all your memories, your culture, your family, your neighborhood, all of that is stored in here, is stored in the configuration of these neurons. And so, you're adjusting the strengths of these connections. As I said, things unplug and replug. This is the central principle, though, that we're going to be talking about, is that brains absorb the world around them. So your world is contained in those 3 pounds. Now, in order to really understand this, we need to start by understanding how brains are really different from other analogies that we might use, for example, our digital computers. So brains are super different from your computer. They are extremely flexible in ways that I think will surprise you. I'll give you an example. So some years ago, there was a clinical case of a 44-year-old man who, normal IQ, had some leg pain. So he went to his doctor to figure out, okay, what what's going on with my leg? So the doctor couldn't figure it out, and he said, well, why don't we get a brain scan, just make sure everything looks normal. So what I'm going to show you first is just what a normal brain scan looks like. So what this is a slice down almost the middle of the brain, and you're just seeing what a normal brain looks like. The thing to pay attention to is the one that's labeled number 3. That's just a space, a volume that's empty in the brain called the lateral ventricle. It's not actually empty. You have fluid flowing through there, cerebrospinal fluid. Anyway, that's what a normal brain looks like. This is what this guy's brain looked like. The lateral ventricle had too much pressure in it. It's called hydrocephalus, and it had squished his brain up against the sides of the skull. Now, the interesting thing is he had probably had this from the time he was a kid. So his brain was always squished up against the side of his skull. Nonetheless, he was married, he had a career, he had kids, he had a normal life. Now this is very weird material. This is not like the kind of stuff we know how to make in Silicon Valley. If I run over my laptop with my truck, it's not going to function. But liveware is a very different kind of beast. So I'll give you another example of this. Where I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, there was a young boy named Matthew who ended up having seizures, epileptic seizures. His parents tried to figure out what to do, and Matthew was having these seizures more and more commonly, to the point where it was multiple times an hour. And so his parents took him around to all the doctors. They ended up flying to other places, and what they finally figured out was that he had something called Rasmussen's encephalitis, which is a form of inflammation that affects an entire hemisphere of the brain. And so the doctors finally told the parents, look, there's actually no choice here except for one thing. There's only one thing that you can do here. Does anyone know what you do with encephalitis like this? It's worse than a lobotomy. What you do is what's called a hemispherectomy, where you remove an entire half of the brain. So for any of you who might have kids, you can imagine the horror for a parent having to take a child in for a surgery like this. But you know what? Hundreds of kids go through this every year, and they're perfectly fine. You can remove half the brain, and the kid is fine. They tend to have a slight limp on the other side of their body, because this side of the brain controls that side of the body. But otherwise, they can do math tests, vocabulary tests. They can get through life just fine. Now, this is quite stunning because, again, I can't take my cell phone and rip out half the circuitry and say, oh, it's still running fine. So there's something very different about liveware, and that's the key. So that's by way of introduction. Now, the second principle that I want to tell you about is about how to think about this in terms of nature and nurture when we're thinking about liveware. So I'm going to be talking this whole course about brain plasticity and the malleability of the circuitry and what can change it. But I want to be clear at the beginning that brains are not born as blank slates. Instead, they come pre-equipped with lots of expectations. Just as an example, when you look at a baby chicken, this is just moments after hatching. It starts wobbling onto its little legs and it moves around and so on. In its environment, it doesn't have months or years to figure out how to move around. And when you look at little human infants, they do all kinds of things that are cute. Like if you stick your tongue out at a human infant, it will imitate you and stick its tongue out. I don't know if any of you have babies, you might have seen this kind of thing before, but this is actually a very sophisticated maneuver because the baby has to see what's going on visually and somehow translate that into the motor act of sticking its tongue out. What this means is that, for a neuroscientist looking at this, we think, okay, look, there's some very sophisticated pre-programming that's going on here. It's not like it's a completely blank slate. This is a feat that requires a sophisticated ability to turn visual input into motor action. So it's not that we have to learn everything. Okay, now, can anyone tell me who this is?
Watson and Crick?
Yes, exactly. This is Crick and Watson. And, in 1953, Francis Crick burst into the Eagle and Child pub in England and said, we have discovered the secret of life. And this was one of the great pub crashing moments of science. And they had just figured out the structure of DNA. It was a really big deal. It was such a big deal because the DNA that we have inside of us, this codes for how to build the brain and the body. By the way, does anyone know if you wrote down, ACTG, if you wrote that into books, all, your human genome, how high a stack of books would that be? You have a guess? No, not to the moon. No, it would be as high as the Washington Monument. As high as the Washington Monument, and that's what you have inside every cell in your body is that amount of information. So it was a great and very important thing. And so this gives the general architecture of your brain and body. But Crick, who I worked with as a postdoc, he was not quite correct that they discovered the secret of life. What they had discovered was actually half the secret to life, because the other half is everything around us. All of the experiences you have, your culture, your neighborhood, your language, your every person you meet, this is what actually wires up your brain to make you who you are. So the way to think about it is that what DNA builds is a machine that rewrites its own circuitry to reflect the world that it's in and to optimize its efficiency in it. And we'll see a lot more about that later. We're not, totally pre-programmed, and we're not a blank slate. The way to think about this correctly is that you have genes and you have your environment, and these interact. So you drop into the world with whatever genes you've got, you have whatever experiences you have, that's what makes you you. And then given your current situation, that'll cause you to behave a particular way, and that feeds back to your experience. And what you can guess is that this makes brains very different from one another, meaning, you each drop into the world slightly different genetics, you all have slightly different experiences, and so brains move off of these trajectories and become as different as, if you look around a room and you look at the faces in the room, faces are very different from one another. Same with brains. I want to give you a quick example of gene-environment interactions. I'm not going to show that many graphs in this course, but I'll just give one quickly, which is there was a scientist, Caspi, who was interested in understanding how the serotonin transporter, a little protein, was related to depression, to your chances of getting depression. And of course, because you inherit half your genetics from your mother and half from your father, you can end up with two flavors of this. You can either end up with the short version twice or the long version twice, or a short and a long. I'm skipping the details because it doesn't matter. But the point is you can have these three different flavors of serotonin transporters that you end up with. Now the question is the serotonin transporter related to depression? The answer is he interviewed a bunch of people after taking their genetics. He interviewed lots of people on what had happened in their life, on the bad, really stressful experiences that had happened to them. Big experiences like a car accident or the death of a loved one, things like that. And what he found was that the number of stressful events correlates with your probability of presenting with major depression, but it depends on the genes that you're carrying. So if you are carrying the short version, then with the number of stressful life events, your probability of presenting with depression goes up much more strongly than if you have, let's say, the long version is what you're carrying. So what does this mean? It means that your probability of presenting with depression is neither just the genes you come to the table with or your life experiences, but it's the intersection of those two. It's which genes you're carrying with and what happens to you in your life. Okay. And so that's the key thing about thinking about life experiences and the genes that you happen to be carrying. I just want you to keep this in mind through the rest of the class, is that we are going to be talking entirely about the remarkable adaptability of the brain and how it adapts to its environment and to the requirements that are presented to it. But that doesn't mean we're born into the world as blank slates. Instead, we come pre-equipped with expectations, and these things interact with one another. Okay, so we're back to this issue about brains absorbing the world around them. So I want to dive into that. So imagine that you were born 30,000 years ago. It's the exact same DNA, you slide out of the womb, but you're in a different world 30,000 years ago. And I want you to think about, would you be you or would you be someone different? So you've got the same DNA, and the question is, okay, would you, look at the beautiful stars in the sky and think about the flora and fauna and think about how you're going to do the hunt and worry about whether it's going to rain at night when you're trying to sleep outdoors or whatever? It's a trick question, because you wouldn't be you at all. Even with the same DNA, you would be such a different person. The reason being that all of your experiences are different. Everything that you've been exposed to, first of all, of course, you'd speak a different language and so on, but all of your experience about society and culture and which arbitrary deities you believe in and all that stuff would be so different. You wouldn't be you. You would have the same DNA, but you wouldn't be the same person. Let me give you another example of what I mean here. Imagine I were to show you two rectangles with different colored pigments in it. Probably wouldn't mean anything to you, right? Like if you were this, you from 30,000 years ago or something. It doesn't have any meaning inherently. But if I show you these rectangles here, that has meaning to you. Whatever it is for each person here, it has meaning to you, but that's just because of your experience in your life. If you were a dog and you looked at these, you would just see rectangles with colors on them. It wouldn't mean anything. So the thing I want you to appreciate about all this forest of neurons in your skull is that these rectangles are meaningless. They accrue meaning only because of the brain plasticity that you have. And by the way, it's because of the way that we absorb the world and remix it that the history of invention and innovation looks the way it does. We'll come back to this point, but if you look at the evolution of anything, vehicles, helmets, bicycles, whatever, cell phones, everything evolves from what came right before it. Now, what is always so striking about this is somebody could have thought of this later helmet, at the beginning, or someone could have thought of making the Tesla right after, Henry Ford made his Model T. Someone could have, but no one does, right? Because the way we actually function in the world is we absorb the world around us, and then we remix what's in our heads. We bend and break and blend it and come up with new ideas. And that's what you see reflected in the history of innovation all around us. Okay, because what we're doing is constantly remixing the world. Now I want to get in a little more detail, which is that what brains do, they don't just adjust themselves with everything coming in, they adjust themselves to the tasks at hand. So, your forest of neurons is responding to the needs around you, the needs and challenges of your life. So if you work on a farm, if you grow up on a farm, you're going to absorb the details of tractors and seasons and seeds and things like that. If you grow up in the big city, you're going to absorb the details of bus routes and elevators and fire escapes and stuff like that. What the brain does is absorb what matters to you. So I'll just give you an analogy. Think about a college campus. Often what happens with a new campus is that the architects will build all the buildings, but they won't lay down the paths yet. And what they do is they see where the students actually go, and when they start laying down those paths, then the architects end up paving that later. The key is that the paths don't get carved randomly by the students. They get carved based on what is relevant to the tasks at hand, where the students need to go. And this is what brains do. I'll give you an analogy here, which is what happened in Japan after World War II. They had been fighting wars for 40 years in Japan, and this was what they were trained as a society to do. They had all these military engineers who were very talented because they had been fighting from the Russo-Japanese War through World War I, World War II. That's all they'd been doing, is designing these fighter planes and things like that. And what happened is, after the fatigue of war and the atomic bombs and so on, Japan was done. War was over, and they had to readjust. They had to figure out what to do with all these military engineers. So what they did was they set themselves to particular tasks, like building this train, this high-speed train, which looks like a fighter plane, by the way. But what happened is Japan adjusted the talents that it had to the needs at hand, to the tasks at hand. They took all these military engineers who'd been working on these great fighter jets and tanks and whatever, and had them design wheels and axles and train shapes and stuff like that. And we will see this is what brains do. They adjust themselves to the tasks that are important, to the tasks that sit in front of them. So the brain is chronically adjusting itself to those tasks. And the question is, why? Why does it sculpt itself like Japan did? Why does it sculpt itself to what is required? The first answer is speed. When it adjusts its own circuitry, what it can do is accomplish things much faster. So essentially, think about it this way. You've got, your consciousness, which is very creative and so on, but takes a long time to figure things out. And then you've got, with a lot of practice, you burn things into the circuitry. You actually make it part of the hardware of the brain. And then you can do things much faster. I'll give you some examples about that. But the second thing, which goes hand in hand with this, is energy efficiency. Once you make something part of the hardware, you can run that. You can really run that fast. So think about, I don't know, if any of you play soccer, when you were an amateur soccer player, you're constantly getting the ball stolen from you, and everything to you is a blur. There's, elbows and knees of people running. You don't really get what's going on that well. Once you become a pro, then you're able to do things fast and efficient, and you're able to run around with the ball and score goals, and just by watching and looking for particular signals, who's coming at you, when, why, what they're going to do, and so on. And so what's going on is you've taken the goal of soccer, you've taken the mission of soccer, and you've burned it down into the circuitry of the brain. You've actually made the brain a soccer playing machine so that you can do things fast and efficient. Just to drive this point, I'll give you another example. Some years ago, I met the world champion cup stacker. So this kid is 10 years old. I don't know if you've seen cup stacking, but there's this whole routine that you do where you stack and you unstack and whatever. It's pretty impressive. I mean, this kid can do it in 3.5 seconds. So it's blindingly fast. So anyway, I decided to compete against him. I had never done cup stacking before. I decided to compete against him while we were both wearing electroencephalography, EEG, so that we could measure what was going on in our brains. Now, obviously, he beat me handily at this, but the question is, because he's so good at this, you might think that his brain is screaming with activity as he's doing this, right? But it's exactly the opposite. His brain is quiet. His brain is doing very little while my brain is screaming off with activity, because I'm like the amateur soccer player trying to figure out what happens next, whereas he's burned it into his circuitry so that he is fast and efficient. One of the first places this was studied was with Tetris players. Scientists trained a group of adolescent girls who had never played Tetris on playing the game and had them play it for 3 months. And then they compared them to a group of girls who had not played Tetris. And what you find, without going into detail, is that all these areas in blue here are the areas that showed greater efficiency. In other words, in the girls who had trained, they were much more efficient at it. And in red, you actually had physical changes, a thicker cortex. And we'll see more of that in later lectures about how you get physical, structural changes in the brain. But again, what you see here with all these blue areas is that more expertise leads not only to, much faster playing, but also more energy efficiency, because you turn the software of trying to figure out what the heck am I going to do with this shape directly into the hardware. That's what we see, is that brains adjust themselves. I want to move to the next principle now, which is that because brains arrive half-baked, they are expecting a world that has particular sorts of inputs in it. For example, a world with love and touch and language around you and things like that. And what we find sometimes are these natural, cruel experiments that happen. For example, when a child is massively deprived or neglected or abused. So one example was from a girl named Jeannie, who was found in Los Angeles. She had been so severely abused by her parents, who had mental illness, and the father couldn't stand noise and didn't want her to make any noise. And what they did was they kept her locked in a dark closet for essentially her whole childhood, and usually constrained in a sleeping bag. And so she was beaten and starved and restrained, and she was found at the age of 13. And there were physical consequences, like she was only 59 pounds and 54 inches tall. But there were also cognitive consequences because of this. She couldn't speak any language. She had only a few words. She could say no, and she could say stop it. And that was all she could say. She couldn't chew solid food. She wasn't toilet trained. She couldn't focus her eyes past 12 feet. So a whole team of psychologists came in, once she was discovered and rescued. They all worked with her and spent all this time and love and attention with her, trying to train her, for example, with language. But it turns out it was too late. And we're going to see more about that later, but it turns out there are these critical windows where your brain has to learn particular things like language. And once it misses that window, once you have missed the window. And I'm not talking about learning a second language. I'm talking about understanding what language is, how you can use words to identify things in the outside world, the rules of grammar, things like that. Once that window is passed, it's too late. We'll see that again in class 7. Cases like this with horrible abuse of a child, unfortunately, this comes up every year where something like this happens. And it's from these cruel natural experiments that we learn that deprivation interferes with development. In other words, when a brain drops in the world, there's expectations that certain things are going to happen. And when you look at Jeannie's brain, what you see is that with extreme neglect, the brain doesn't even develop normally. And in fact, in the Romanian orphanages, what happened after the fall of Ceausescu, there were tens of thousands of children who ended up in these orphanages because their parents had been killed. And so the staff was totally overwhelmed. And so what they did is they said, look, the right thing to do is don't talk to the kids and don't touch the kids, because if you do that, they'll become clingy. And so what they did is they would feed the kids and so on, but they wouldn't, speak to them or touch them. And all these kids grew up with real cognitive deficits as a result. And again, this is the kind of thing that teaches us, okay, what brains need is there's a whole expectation, unlike the Komodo dragon who drops into the world and can just go do his thing. A child needs lots of input from the world. So when Mother Nature made this very flexible circuitry, she had to assume that the starting input would be okay. And this leads to the overarching principle for today's lecture, which is that your DNA doesn't build this fixed hardware for the brain. What yours does is build a system that adapts to the world around it, and it's expecting the right sorts of inputs. Okay, so we're going to wrap up lecture 1, and I want you to think about this issue of who you would be if you were born 30,000 years ago. What would be the same and what would be different given all of the world that you have absorbed? So the question is, would you be you? And to the extent that that's not true, that is the degree to which your brain has been shaped by the world around you. And this is what we're going to come to understand in great depth in this course. And it's because of the study of brain plasticity that my favorite quotation is from Martin Heidegger, who said, "Every man is born as many men and dies as a single one." And you probably have a sense of what this quotation means, but by the end of this course, I promise that you'll understand this very deeply, the optionality with which we come into the world and the way the world shapes us by its experiences. So that's what brain plasticity is about, and that's what we're going to master in the coming lectures. Okay, so what we saw is that we are very different from all of our nearest neighbors in the animal kingdom in terms of having taken over the world, and it's all because of brain plasticity. We don't drop into the world pre-programmed, but instead we come flexibly into the world such that by the time you are a little child, you can come to learn everything that all the Homo sapiens before you have figured out. You can learn that and then springboard off the top of that. That's very different from what your dog does, or the Komodo dragon, or the horse, or the chicken, who just come into the world and they say, okay, I got it, eat, mate, swim, whatever they're doing, and they just do that one thing. And that's why we have become such a runaway species. We also saw that your DNA sets up your brain and body, but for the rest of this course, we won't be talking about the pre-programmed stuff. We're just going to be talking about how the DNA has set you up so that you are an adaptive system. And finally, we saw that this strategy of Mother Nature's is a little bit of a gamble, because if you're not getting the right input from the world, the system does not develop optimally. Okay, so that's it, and I'll take any questions.
All right, so I've been following along Ian McGilchrist's concept of like the hemispheric differentiation between the right and the left. I'm wondering, with the child that had to get his, what hemisphere was taken out? Do you know?
Yes, so great question. With a hemispherectomy, you can actually remove either hemisphere. And it turns out that this idea of there being a big difference between the left and the right hemisphere is a little bit illusory. The two hemispheres are mostly alike. They're almost entirely alike, and the only difference really is that the left hemisphere tends to do finer motor movement, which is why it's involved in speech. and the right hemisphere is involved in sort of broader, what are called grosser motor movements. But turns out the most amazing thing about the hemispherectomy is that you can remove either one, and the other one says, whoa, gosh, I better make sure that I wire up all the functions over here.
Sorry, so the question is essentially about consciousness and how that relates to your brain, and how is it that you mentioned that, okay, if we were dropped in the world like a million years from, or not a million, but a long time ago, would we be completely different? But how does that work with consciousness, being that it seems like our consciousness is able to separate itself almost from our brain and being able to look at ourselves in a way that's doesn't really make sense with if ourselves were just part of our neurology, if that makes
Okay,
sense.
cool question. So the key thing about consciousness is that it emerges from the operation of these 86 billion neurons. Your consciousness is a function of that. Now, how do we know that? Well, first of all, it's easy for you to change your consciousness. All you need to do is pour some ethanol over your mucosal membranes, and then you'll be drunk and your consciousness will be different, right? You take psychedelic drugs and now you're talking with silver leprechauns about the secrets of the cosmos. You hit your head and you lose consciousness. You get some disease state that does something to the neurons and your consciousness changes. So that's how we know that consciousness is a function of this very delicate balance of what's going on with these 86 billion neurons. And in fact, the reason I'm using the word delicate or fragile is because I'm always struck by this. When you look at something like a psychedelic drug, it's just some molecule that binds to receptors on neurons, and it changes the flow through the system by, 5% or something. And yet, completely changes your consciousness. It's because what that illustrates to me is how fragile the system is. And Mother Nature goes through a lot of trouble to keep consciousness just in this very tight range, because in that range, I hypothesize, that's when we can work together and build cities and skyscrapers and symphonies and so on. But if everyone were in this slightly different range, then it would never work, and our species would never have made it. So, point is, consciousness emerges from the exact functioning of what's happening under the hood.
Okay. My question is on efficiency. You presented those two experiments with the cups. Is there an average on how quickly the brain adapts to a new task at hand? I think about businesses, employers hiring new people to their team. Is there a specific time frame where a new task you achieve a level of efficiency?
Yeah, great question. You might have heard of the 10,000 hour rule. So that number is totally made up, but it's approximately what it indicates is that you have to put a lot of work into digging things down into the brain. And we're going to see more about this in lecture 5. We're going to see this in great detail, actually. But there are things that you can cognitively know, like let's say a kid who doesn't yet know how to ride a bicycle. Let's say you explain exactly how a bicycle, you still need to spend the hours doing the thing and learning the balance, all of which becomes unconscious. For example, you can ride a bicycle, but presumably you can't articulate to me how you do that. So that's where this 10,000 hour rule comes from. But what we'll see in lecture 5 is that there are even some more subtleties to it, as in it has to be relevant to you for your brain to even make the changes and encode it.
You were mentioning about our brain giving us windows of maybe learning a new language, or does that apply to just languages, or?
Great question. We'll come back to this, but it turns out that the idea of learning what language is has to be done in the first few years. You can learn other languages at any point in your life. You can learn second languages and third languages, but learning how to speak language has to happen at the beginning. And by the way, there are all kinds of subtleties even within that, and we will talk about this in a later lecture, but something like accent. If you move to a new country before about the age of 13, you won't have any accent in the language of that country. But if you move after 13, you typically do retain an accent. So there are many aspects to language.
We have a nation of single moms, single men who are lonely and without purpose, children who are dad deprived. I think all of us want to understand what is happening with boys. Why are they falling so far behind girls in every single academic area? Women have women's centers and men also have men's centers. They're called prisons, centers for dad-deprived boys. There doesn't need to be as much pressure on men to have to do jobs that they don't want to do in order to make more money. More U.S. military are killed by suicide in 1 year than were killed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in all years combined. And yet you very rarely hear about that. There are so many challenges that are unexplored that boys are experiencing. Dad-deprived boys are far more likely to bully, far more likely to be bullied. 7 out of the 8 boys that did school shootings, dad-deprived boys. What does the future hold for boys and men? I could not be hired at any major university in the United States for saying the things you've heard in the last 2 days. That's how dangerous talking this way is. Let me spend a little bit of time giving you a bit of background so you understand where I'm coming from. This is me, actually, with a fellow woman named Gloria Steinem, who you may recognize. And my first days in gender issues were with the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City. As I got involved with them, they were having a big debate as to whether or not there should be men involved in the National Organization for Women or not. And the main issue was that every month they had what they called consciousness-raising groups to make women more aware of the degree to which men had a system of patriarchy that was keeping them oppressed and the degree to which they felt they were able to get in touch with the things that were bothering them. And so the problem was that when men attended these once per month meetings, the women felt very inhibited from really opening up and saying what they really felt. And that was, from my perspective, totally understandable. And so they were debating whether to kick men out completely from now. And their compromise, I'm always a compromise, the compromise was me. And they said, listen, let Warren Farrell form some men's groups and get the men out of the women's hair, and let's see if that works. And so I did do that. And it worked from their perspective. And I went through 2 phases in that era. Phase 1 was getting the men together. And then after they spoke for a minute or 2, I give them a feminist lecture as to why they were wrong and why a feminist perspective was more accurate and how their consciousness was not raised. And one day I decided to actually listen as opposed to telling them a different ideology. And as I started listening, they didn't trust me at first, but eventually they opened up and began telling stories that I sort of resonated with in my own life, and my father's information to me about why I shouldn't be a writer, for example, because a writers rarely find publishers, and if you can't find a publisher, you'll never find a wife. Therefore, just do something that makes money. You're good at math, so do math. But then I began to be in touch with my own feelings and sort of more open to what they were really saying and what they were really feeling. And here I was telling them to feel, but I was lecturing to them, which did not draw out their feelings. And so once I started to do that listening, I began to sort of integrate some of those to my lectures. I was now lecturing all around the world on women's issues and the importance of women's issues, both to women and also to men. But now I started integrating some of the boys' and men's perspectives, or the perspectives of the men and the fathers, and sharing what their sons' perspectives were. And as I did that, instead of expanding my audience, it shrank my audience. My standing ovations went from standing ovations to sitting ovations. My referrals to other speaking engagements, which was my source of income, went from about 4 per speech to down to 1, then down to 0 to 1. And so I began to see the handwriting on the wall. But I also thought it was important to sort of share both sexes' perspective as opposed to just one's. And then sort of the straw that broke the camel's back was I was at a board meeting of the National Organization for Women in New York City, and I started to see the beginning of the evidence This was the early 70s, and there was already a lot of divorces occurring that to a much greater degree than in the 60s and the 50s. And so I started to see that the first children of divorce were not doing very well, but particularly those children that did not have fathers involved after the divorce. And so I mentioned some of this information to the board members, and total silence. And finally, one of the women, one of the braver ones, spoke up and said, Warren, the National Organization for Women has a lot of issues to deal with. Our feminist members, they want to be able to say, after divorce, let us decide what's right for the children. If we want the father involved, we should have the father involved. If we don't want the father involved, we shouldn't have to have the father involved. If we force them into sort of this equal shared parenting stuff that you're talking about, this is going to alienate some members, and that will lose them not only for the custody issues, but also for other issues that we want to support. Well, I understood that, but I didn't feel very good about that. And then they also pointed out to me that, Warren, your source of income comes from almost all feminist referrals. Just let that sink in. And I had already told them that this was just the beginning of the research. And so the compromise, quote unquote, was for me to go out and do more research before I spoke up. And in fact, I did. But the more research I did, the more I began to see that this was not just the beginning of data. I was identifying to them about 5 or 6 ways that boys in particular, but also girls, suffered when they didn't have dad involvement. I was now beginning to accumulate some of the data that eventually led me to identifying more than 50 different ways, from suicide to depression to many of the things that I'll talk about. And actually, before I do talk about some of those things in terms of what's statistically true, let me just ask you for a moment, would you close your eyes for a moment with me? And just think about people in your neighborhood or your school or in your family that have had problems with both boys and girls. And think about whether there's been more boys affected negatively by a tendency to sort of emotionally withdraw, become addicted to video games, get poorer grades in school, be belligerent, have problems with their own motivation. Raise your hand if some of the boys that you know or know of are more likely to have these problems than girls. Just open your eyes and raise your hand. So I'm seeing every hand raised, so 100% of us have seen that. And this, I'm not just talking about an isolated incident here and there, but about a pattern that is dominant in the culture. And unfortunately, many of us have seen this, but not necessarily seen the complete evidence that surrounds this. What I'll be sharing with you today is, and tomorrow and the next day, is 3 things. 1 is the overall evidence for the boy crisis. 2, 5 of the most important causes, and then about a dozen solutions. And those solutions will be at both the personal level, like family dinner nights, and also at the political level, like at the national level, the school level, and the local level. The boy crisis exists both in the United States and globally in the 70 largest developed nations. So I'm going to start with the evidence of the US crisis and then move to the global crisis. Here's a bit of the evidence of the US crisis. You can begin to see that when boys and girls are both 9 years old or under, they both commit suicide very rarely, and they commit suicide at about an equal level. But at the ages of 10 to 14, boys commit suicide at twice the rate of girls. Between the ages of 15 and 19, at 4 times the rate of girls. And between the ages of 20 and 24, between about 5.5 times the rate of girls. So you can see that something during the years in which boys learn to be boys does not inspire all boys, to say the least. I'm going to look at the mental health besides suicide for boys. More U.S. military are killed by suicide in 1 year than were killed in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan in all years combined. and yet you very rarely hear about that. In the mental health area in the United States, there's a huge gap between what happens with teenage boys and teenage girls. Between 5 and 7 hours of video games per week are actually pretty healthy by most studies. Teenage boys use video games, though, about 13 plus hours a week, and that's gone up even more recently. Teenage girls use them about 5 hours a week. So there's a big difference between the video game usage between our sons and our daughters. And here's the implications of that. Playing video games motivates our brain to win at the game, but it doesn't motivate us to win at life. I'll explain the difference there. Video games have a lot of the stimulus when they're in excess that cocaine has. Playing video games motivates our brain to win at the game, but it doesn't motivate our brain to win at life. And here's the distinction between those two in the brain. Real life achievements get registered in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex of the brain, and video game success creates dopamine, and that's a feel-good drug in the nucleus accumbens part of the brain, and that rewards you for winning at the game, but it doesn't reward you for winning at life. Two different motivators in the brain. It's one of the reasons why people who are younger and they really get on a high from winning game after game, and they think that that's really increasing their brain's power overall. It is increasing their brain's power in the area that stimulates them to win more games, distinct from what helps them win at life in general. And so that's a huge, huge difference. And it's one of the reasons we see so many kids moving to an addiction level at video games, but not kids in general, to a much greater degree, boys. By age 21, boys average 14,000 hours of gaming. You can achieve a bachelor's degree in about a third of that time. To me, that's amazing. Let's move over from mental health to physical health in the United States. In just 90 years, the male-female life expectancy gap in the U.S. Has increased more than 400%. In 1920, there was only 1 year difference between male life expectancy and female life expectancy. In 2021, the year from the most recent data, 5.3 year life expectancy gap between males and females. Male life expectancy is decreasing. Before COVID, which is the only fair time to measure life expectancy for obvious reasons, the 3 years before COVID, male life expectancy went down 3 years in a row. That's an historical first for non-COVID, non-war era. But female life expectancy did not. Obviously, no one wants female life expectancy to decrease, but we also don't want male life expectancy to decrease, especially 3 years in a row. That's when it really shows a pattern that is problematic. Boys today have sperm counts less than half of what their grandfathers had at their age. And of course, that affects the fertility and the health and vitality of female children. This is really a good example of the impact of either sex having problems. If you have the sperm counts of males going down, that affects female children as well as male children. And it's really a perfect metaphor for what happens when we're all in the same family boat. When it appears that only one sex loses, obviously both sexes lose. For the first time in U.S. history, our sons will have less education than their dads. Take a look here at bachelor's degrees. Notice that on the upper left-hand side, you see a male figure. The bachelor degrees in 1969, boys got 57% of the bachelor's degrees. Girls or women got 43%. In 2020, the trend has reversed. Boys get 42% of bachelor degrees, women 58%. It's projected that in a few years, the ratio of female to male bachelor's degrees will become 2 to 1. One of the reasons for that is that boys get admitted to college at a certain rate, but drop out 10% more frequently than girls do. So you add the fewer admissions together with the greater failure in school during college, despite affirmative action programs now beginning to go in the direction of males, getting them into college. The males are still dropping out at a faster rate. There are today more than 2.8 million more women than men with post-secondary school degrees. 2.8 million difference. So let's look at the implications of that for families. Female graduates are rarely on the lookout for future fathers who are dropouts. Female graduates do not tend to be highly attracted to male dropouts. And yet there are 2.8 million more women either competing for this much smaller group of men or saying, I can't take it. I'm going to be a single mom. So we see the single mom data, and this is one of the reasons for that single mom data. So let's look at the whole picture here. As for male high school dropouts, more than 20% of male high school dropouts, which are much more common among young men than women, more than 20% of them are unemployed in their 20s. So imagine a woman who's a college graduate wanting to have a future husband who's about her equal, looking around for a future husband. She has those considerations, and she also has another consideration. Boys today are 66% of the people likely to live back with their parents, usually in their parents' basements. So imagine this female walking around with a sign saying, looking for a future husband, please. And she searches unemployment lines. Well, maybe not. Then she searches parents' basements and she puts, any dropouts in here? It's not a likely scenario for a female to feel inspired. And again, it's an example of the lose-lose situation. Boys and men appear to be the losers, and yes, they are, but they're also girls and women who are looking for responsible, talented, intelligent, equally educated males to be the fathers of their children, and they can't find them either. And so it's another example when either sex loses, both sexes lose. So in brief, you have fewer bachelor's degrees and more bachelors. And here's the trend. We have a nation of single moms, and we have a nation of single men who are lonely and without purpose. We have a nation of children who are dad deprived. So that's 3 groups, but there's actually 4 lose-lose-lose situations. Men, women, children, and our nation. Let's look at IQs for a moment. Boys who are nearly 12 years old today are doing only as well as the 8 to 9-year-old boys in the 70s on their IQ tests. We'll see that this is not just in the United States, but I'll get to this data globally as well. So let me switch over to the evidence for a global crisis. All around the world, they have terms that imply a boy crisis. In China, it's women up, men down. In Japan, it's herbivores or socially isolated. In a good part of Europe, it's an acronym called NEAT, which is not in education, employment, or training. And in Sweden recently, they identified it as the boy crisis. I don't know whether my book had any impact or not, but I'll make believe it did. In India, the male suicide rate in India is growing more than 9 times that of the female suicide rate, 37% male versus 4% female since the year 2000. In the UK, in 2015, more men died by suicide than all British soldiers fighting in all wars since 1945. part of the amazing part of this data is the data. Another part is that almost nobody has heard of this before. If these things were happening to girls and women, it would be all over the news and we'd all be really aware of it. And we all should be really aware of it because nobody would want this to be happening to girls and women. The research published in the medical journal Lancet, which you've probably all heard of, says suicide now takes more lives than war, murder, and natural disasters combined, stealing more than 36 million healthy years of healthy life around the world. The evidence on the global level, that's physical. If male and female mortality rates were equal, it would save more lives than curing cancer. The results of a 20 country study concluded this data about female and male mortality rates saving more lives than curing cancer if they were both equal. Boys today have sperm counts less than half of what their grandfathers had at their age. Notice that this is global, as well as what we all already saw being U.S. sperm counts. The UN finds that boys have fallen behind girls in every one of 70 of the largest developed nations, especially in reading and writing. And as you probably all know, reading and writing are the single biggest predictors of academic success or failure. They're not the biggest predictors of life success or failure. The biggest predictors of life success or failure is postponed gratification. But the biggest predictor of academic success or failure is the ability to read and write. And that's also a big predictor of life success or failure. Note that the U.S. is last among 31 nations when comparing the decline in degree attainment of males between the ages of 25 and 34 versus the generation before, ages 55 to 64. Here's the big discovery about IQs. Usually IQs go up about 10 points per generation. In the almost 2 generations since 1980, that would predict IQs on average going up about 20 points. But instead, boys' IQs have dropped 15 points since the 1980s. So if you add those 20 points to the 15 points, you have almost 35-point loss of potential IQ as a result of the dynamics that we'll be discussing that have led to the boy crisis. What a loss for not just boys, but for everybody that interacts with boys. So I'd like to get now into some of the causes for this. I want to say first that there's a lot of causes to the boy crisis. And I was tempted to go with a lot of the causes that we all sort of see identified around us. Causes such as the lack of male teachers, there's a cutting back on recess, there's a cutting back on vocational education. These causes have been out there in the media, but they're not the real causes. They are the symptoms. What I want to deal with this group is the underlying causes that are creating these symptoms so we can really deal with it at that deeper level. And one of those causes we've already touched on briefly, which is a half.
So yeah, I'm done for the day. I got what I wanted, and yeah, which was a young Yana 1-to-1, since this could be a potential reversal or a retracement. So yeah, I'd rather take small wins, and if we do get like below that, then yeah, it is what it is. So yeah guys, wins do compound, same as losses can compound. So yeah, that was a nice 1-to-1 trade, and yeah, we waited, we broke this order block here, the retracement into that fair value gap, stop loss above that. Then yeah, this was nice. This was nice to mitigate this gap and come below those lows. So yeah, it was nice. It was nice. It was nice. So yeah. Do subscribe, and yeah, let's meet again. Let's meet again. And yeah.